Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Ches is all about dirt and ashes and when it's muktzah and when it's not muktzah. The Gemara begins by trying to understand a cryptic phrase in the Mishnah that says that the ash of an oven is not muktzah. The Gemara will explain it. Then the Gemara gets into when ashes and dirt are muktzah and cannot be used for covering the blood of a slaughtered bird or chaya, and when they are not muktzah, and when they're not muktzah at all, and you're even allowed to use it for any purpose you want. The Gemara brings a statement about when they're not muktzah and you can use it for anything you want. Then the Gemara shows that you have a Beitzah that says you can't use it for a suffix animal that is obligated in covering its blood, meaning an animal which may or may not have an obligation to have its blood be covered when you slaughter it. The Gemara will see that as a kasha. The Gemara will give 5 or 6 approaches, 3 final approaches that the Gemara will actually accept. So let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara is commenting on the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said, "At a machlokes between Beisil and Beishamai, are you allowed to lechatchila slaughter an animal that there is a mitzvah to cover its blood on Yom Tov? Those are a bird and a chaya. So are you allowed to slaughter these creatures on Yom Tov?" Beis Hillel said no, but Beis Hillel says, the Mishnah says, if you slaughtered it already, they agree that you are allowed to cover it. And then it adds a cryptic line, and it says, because the ash of a oven is not muktzah, it's considered to be prepared for use. So the Gemara says, what does that have to do with anything? How does that explain why they agree that you're allowed to slaughter the bird or chaya, that if you slaughter the bird or chaya on Yom Tov already, that you're allowed to cover its blood? So the Gemara says it's not really meant to be an explanation. It's not that they're saying because the ash of an oven is prepared. They are saying and the ash of an oven is prepared. Now the Gemara makes this fit into the wording of the Mishnah without having to change anything. But the idea is that they're saying you're allowed to use anything to cover its blood for sure. Anything which is not muktzah. And one example of something which is not muktzah is ashes of an oven. So it comes out that Beis Hillel are agreeing to 2 things. They're agreeing, number 1, if you slaughtered the animal and now you need to cover its blood, you're allowed to. And number 2, if you have oven ash around, that's usable for covering blood. First of all, it's considered to be a valid offer. You can use it to cover blood. And second of all, it's not muktzah, and therefore if you have that around, you're always allowed to slaughter an animal. So now the Gemara says there are some conditions as to this ash. First of all, it has to be that the ash was already ash before Yom Tov. It cannot be that it was wood before Yom Tov and you burned it on Yom Tov, because then you mentally separated from it as being useful. It was only wood. It didn't have a function as being ashes. And ashes doesn't have a function when Yom Tov begins. The fact that you want to use it now to cover the blood does not count as having had a function beforehand. And therefore it's functionless, and therefore it's muktzah. Says the Gemara, but it's possible that it will have a different function, and that is if the ash is still warm enough from the fire that you could still roast in it, then the smallest thing you could possibly roast would be an egg. So then it's not muktzah because you could roast the egg, you could put the egg in it and mix it around as part of the roasting process, then it's not muktzah. Since it's not muktzah because it could be used for roasting, it's also usable for covering the blood. That is not a problem. Now the Gemara quotes a Beitzah that says that exact halacha spelled out clearly, and it also adds another halacha. It says that if somebody brings earth into his house, or to his chorva, that's his ruined area, or to his yard, the garden, so it's a very large amount, then he's allowed to spread it around on the floor, and he's allowed to use it for whatever purpose he wants. It's considered to be that since he brought it in, he trucked in earth that he has in mind to use it for whatever he wants. That's not muktzah. A person could have all kinds of uses for this earth, and therefore he's allowed to use it. Now Rav Yehuda the Amora adds halacha that even if he just brings a small amount of earth, just like a basketful or something, as long as he puts it in the corner and he leaves it piled up and he doesn't spread it, it's also considered to be something that he wants to use, and he's allowed to use it for whatever purpose he wants. He has in mind, whatever I need it for, I'll use it for. Now that's different than if it's a large amount of earth. If it's a large amount of earth, he has in mind to use it even if it's spread around, because it doesn't become just part of the ground. He has like an earth pile, an earth collection, which he spread around. If it's a small pile, then he has to keep it in the pile form in a specific corner. Okay, now the Gemara has a kasha on Rav Yehuda from Beitzah. And this is going to be the rest of the daf. Primarily, we'll be answering this kasha. So Rav Yehuda had said that if you have a pile of earth, then you can use it for whatever purpose you want. The Gemara says, we have a Beitzah that says that if you shecht a koi on Yom Tov, you should not cover its blood. Now, a koi is an animal which we're not clear if it's a behema or a chaya. There's two important halachas to being a behema and a chaya. First of all, a chaya has to have its blood covered. A behema, which is a domesticated animal, a chaya is a wild animal, a behema is a domesticated animal. A wild animal like a chaya, you have to cover its blood, and its chaylev is permitted to be eaten. That certain fats are permitted to be eaten. A behema, you don't have to cover its blood. It's a domesticated animal. You don't have to cover its blood. And all these fats are forbidden. They're usher. So now, this koi is a suffix. We're not clear which one it is. We don't know if it is a behema or a chaya, if it's considered to be domesticated or wild, and if we don't know if you have to cover its blood or not. Since you don't know, the Beitzah says, don't shecht it on Yantif, and if you do, you can't cover its blood. So the Gemara says, why can't you cover its blood? According to Yehuda, you have a pile of dirt, you're allowed to use it for whatever you want. So, the Gemara says, it's a kasha on Rav Yehuda. The Gemara says it's not a kasha on Rav Yehuda. There are other types of materials which you could also use for whatever you want. We just said in the Mishnah said you're allowed to use ashes from an oven for whatever you want. So why don't you ask the same thing on the Mishnah? If you have ashes from the oven, you can use it for whatever you want. Also, the Mishnah said that if you have a spade, we saw in the Gemara yesterday explaining the Mishnah, if you have a spade already stuck in the earth, you're allowed to use that for whatever you want. So there are other materials you could use for whatever you want. And this Mishnah, this Beitzah says you're not allowed to shechta safek chaya, koi, and if you do, don't cover its blood. What's going on? You could ask the same thing. Use one of these other things that you're allowed to use for whatever purpose you want. Obviously, the Beitzah is talking about in a situation where you don't have those things. You don't have ashes of an oven. You don't have a spade already stuck in the ground. So Yehuda will tell you it's where you don't have a basket of earth. What's the problem? There isn't any issue here. It's referring to where you don't have these things. So the Gemara says, no, but the problem is this. If you don't have these things, it's not just a koi that you can't shecht, and if you do shecht, you can't cover its blood. If you don't have these things, that even a regular chaya, which you definitely have to cover the blood, you don't have anything to cover with, so you can't shecht. And you can't, and if you do shecht, you can't cover its blood with anything. You don't have anything to use. So, according to you, that we're talking about where the guy doesn't have, so why does it say only a koi? Only something which is a suffix, whether it's chayav or not. The same thing should apply to a vadai chaya, a deer. Shecht a deer. You're not allowed to shecht it if you don't have something prepared to cover its blood. And if you do, then if you do shecht it, then there's nothing you could use that you don't cover its blood. That's what Beis Hillel's psak in the Mishnah was. So Gemara gives a couple of answers here. The first version, the first answer the Gemara wants to say is it's true. A chaya, a vadai chaya, that's for sure obligated in the mitzvah of covering the blood, you still cannot shecht it unless you have some dirt prepared. And a suffix, you also can't shecht. The bigger chiddush is the suffix. Why is that a bigger chiddush? It's a bigger chiddush that you can't shecht it on Yom Tov if you don't have something to cover the blood, because there's a strong possibility that you don't even have to cover the blood. So I may think, listen, I need meat for Yom Tov. So chaya, which I definitely have to cover its blood, and I can't cover its blood without violating an Isser Muktzah or something, so then I won't check that. But a koi, maybe I can check that. It's only a suffix. So I'll go with the tzad, I'll go with the possibility that I won't have to cover its blood, and I won't cover its blood, and then at least I'll have meat for Yantif. It'll be Mekayim the mitzvah of Simchas Yantif. So on that it says, no, you cannot just assume that possibility. You still have to cover its blood, and you can't, and therefore you should not shecht it at all. So the Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says this only works on the first phrase of the Beitzah, which says that you're not allowed to shecht it. So I said the chiddush is it's a suffix animal. It's a suffix whether it's chayiv in the first place in the mitzvah of covering the blood. So somebody may say, I might think that I'm allowed to shecht it. So the Mishnah says, no, you're not allowed to shecht it. But if it's referring to, if you analyze the last line of the Mishnah, which says that if you shecht it, you're not allowed to cover its blood, that's not something that makes sense in a suffix more than a vadai. It's not something that makes sense in a koi more than in a regular chaya. If if you already shechted it, is more of a reason in a chaya you should be allowed to cover its blood than in a suffix where you might not even have an obligation to cover its blood in the first place. So therefore, the Mishnah cannot be referring to, like you're saying, it's referring to a suffix, and that's the chiddush, and a vadai for sure. That wouldn't make sense in the last line where it says that if you shechted it already, you're not allowed to cover its blood. According to what you're saying, you should be allowed to cover the blood if it's a vadai. So obviously you're wrong. We're not referring to where there's no permitted earth around. You do have a pile of earth set aside. And the question then returns, why can I not shecht it and cover its blood? If I have a pile of earth set aside, according to Yehuda, who says I'm allowed to use it for anything I want. So even if it's just a suffix, whether it's chayav or not, I should still be allowed to use it to cover the blood because it's not mukta. I had in mind for any function that I want. I could use it to cover the blood even of an animal that's only a suffix. So the Gemara gives another answer here. The Gemara says Rabba, possibly Rava, depending on the girsa, that when we say that the ashes of an oven is not mukta and it's set aside to be usable, that's only for covering the blood of a chaya, of a vadai animal. That's where you could say that it's set aside and it's usable, and that would apply to Yehuda as well. That it's got to be that it's a vadai chayav. That's where you say that's one of the uses you had in mind, where you wanted to. Well, I don't know if it's because you had it in mind, but that's one of the uses that you're allowed to use to use ashes from an oven or dirt that you had in a basket and you set aside in your house. It's only to cover the blood of a vadai animal that's chayav in kisi adam, and that's a chayav. If it's a suffix, then you're not allowed to use that. So Gemara says, why not? So Gemara has a couple of options here. First of all, maybe because when you dig out the ashes or the dirt, you're making a hole. You're not allowed to make a hole on Shabbos. So Gemara says, why should there be a difference between a suffix or a vadai? Even if it's a vadai, you shouldn't be allowed to make a hole on Shabbos. Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me because making a hole is not such a problem. It's only Nisa D'Rabbanan. Because like we saw on the daf yesterday, the Isser D'Oraisa is only where you're making a hole because you want a hole, not where you're making a hole because you want the dirt. So Gemara says, if you're going to go with that, then that shouldn't be a difference between a suffix and a vadai. It should both be true. So says the Gemara, maybe the difference is that we're concerned that while you're shoveling the dirt or the ash, you may come to crush it up. You'll do an Isser D'Oraisa of Ketisha. So it says, again, why should that be a difference between if it's a vadai or a suffix? Either way, you're violating Isser D'Oraisa of Ketisha. So where it says no, because Ketisha you're allowed to violate for a vadai because you're being mekayim the mitzvah of covering the blood. And now covering the blood is a mitzvah asay. It's a positive commandment. Ketisha is a lois asay. You're violating Hilchos Yom Tov where it says lois asay kol malacha. So an asay beats a lois asay. You have to be mekayim a mitzvah d'oraisa. You're allowed to beat the lois asay. So Gemara says, okay, but first of all, the same thing should apply to a suffix. Why is it only for a vadai? So here the Gemara doesn't explain it, but the answer seems to be because on a suffix you don't know if you're fulfilling a mitzvah or not. You might be fulfilling a mitzvah, you can't do an isser. If you're definitely fulfilling a mitzvah, then you could do an isser. But the Gemara says that's still not going to help you because we only say you only say that the fulfillment of a positive commandment allows you to violate a negative commandment if it's the same activity that does both. Such as if you're doing a bris milah and while you're doing the bris milah you're cutting off a piece of taras, so you're doing a mitzvah of bris, but you're violating an issur of cutting off taras. You're not allowed to cut off taras, but it's one action, so that action is permitted because you allow it because of the mitzvah that is included in it, even though it's also an avera. The same thing applies to wearing tzitzis, which is also shatnez. So you're allowed to do that. The same action of putting the tzitzis on gives you both the mitzvah and the avera. Here, first you're crumbling up the earth, and then later you're going to use it to cover the blood. So that's not the same action, and therefore you can't say that they go head to head, the mitzvah and the avera, the mitzvah that you're fulfilling and the isser that you're ostensibly violating, and therefore that it would not allow you to do that. Someone says no. We're talking about ketisha here, where you're crumbling it. So if you're standing directly over the blood as you scoop it, then you will crumble it directly onto the blood, and in one activity, you'll fulfill the mitzvah of covering the blood at the same time that you do the issur of crumbling it up. And therefore, it's okay. So Gemara says this answer still doesn't work because Yontif is not just a mitzvah loisasei. Yontif is an asay and a loisasei. The Torah in its description of what you should do says it should be Shabbos Shabbosayin. You should not do malacha. That's both an asay and a loisasei. While covering the blood is only chesel bafar, is only a mitzvah asay, and therefore it's 2 against 1, and therefore you are not allowed to do the mitzvah of kisei dam at the expense of Hilchos Yontif. The Gemara therefore now gives another answer. This comes from Rava. Rava says when a person gathers some dirt and he sets it aside, he only has in mind that he's going to use it for things which he knows which will be a vadai use, something he'll for sure need, something which he may or may not need it for. He does not have that in mind, and therefore as far as that's concerned, it's muktzah. Now, therefore, a suffix, which is a may or may not need, he did not have that in mind to use the dirt for a suffix, and therefore it's muktzah, and he cannot use it to cover the blood of a koi. However, for a vadai, he is allowed to use, and that's why the Mishnah says, the Beitzah says he cannot use the dirt to cover the blood of a koi, even according to Yehuda, even though it was set aside for any purpose he wants. Now this fits very well with another thing that Rava says. Rava says that if somebody sets up dirt to use it to cover blood, he is not allowed to use it to cover fecal matter of a child that was left lying around. If a child leaves waste around, you have to cover it up. You can't say a bracha when it's there, if it's inside the house or near where people live. Now Rava says the reason you can't do that is because that's a suffix. You don't know that a child is going to leave excrement around in a place where you'll need to cover it. He may or may not, but because it's a suffix, therefore you didn't have that in mind. And the dirt which you set aside to use for a vadai use, such as covering blood of an animal you're planning to shecht, you cannot use for a suffix use. If it's the other way, though, Rava says, if you brought the dirt in order to use to cover freaker matter, so then you set it aside for a suffix use, you're definitely allowed to use it for a vadai use. Now, the Gemara notes that Nahar Beloi, who Rashi points out is identified in Sanhedrin as Rami Bar Barivi, Nahar Beloi says the other way. Nahar Beloi says, no, even covering fecal matter is a vadai use. If you have a child in the house, he's definitely going to leave something around. And therefore, even if you set aside a dirt to use to cover blood, you are definitely allowed to use it to cover fecal matter because those are both vadai uses. Now, the Gemara says that the same machlekes exists in Eretz Yisrael, and there was Rav Yosef Bar Chama and Rabbi Zera, or perhaps Rava, the son of Yosef Bar Chama and Rabbi Zera. One said that covering fecal matter is like a koi, and therefore it's a suffix use, and one said it's a vad use. The Gemara says probably Rava, just like Rava says here that it's a suffix use. Rava's the one there who says it's a suffix use, even though we did not know necessarily who that was. Okay, now the Gemara gives another answer to the question of why you can't cover the blood of a koi. This is a new type of approach. It's Rami Breda of Yeva says if you'll cover the blood of a koi, people will learn from there, you're covering its blood, it's a chaya. If it's a chaya, then it's chaylev, its fats are permitted, because fats, chaylev that are forbidden fats, are only aser in a behema. They're not forbidden in a chaya. This animal is a chaya, must be that its fats are okay and you can eat it. Now that's a bad conclusion, because we don't know what it is, we're only covering the blood misafik. Gemara says if that's true, then you shouldn't cover the blood of a koi even during the week. People will draw the same conclusion. So Gemara has two approaches to why during the week there's no problem. The Gemara first wants to say during the week people will think you're not covering the blood because it's a mitzvah to cover the blood. They think you're covering the blood because you want to clean up your yard. You don't want blood lying around your yard. And if you're doing it on Yantiv, though, you're not allowed to clean up your yard on Yantiv. You must be doing it as a mitzvah, and therefore people will draw the conclusion that it's chaylev is not aser. Gemara says that answer only works if it's shechted in your yard. It doesn't work if it's shechted in the garbage heap, and it doesn't work if somebody comes to ask, should I cover my blood or not? The blood of my koi. You wouldn't be able to answer him then. And we have not seen that there's a differentiation in this halacha, that it makes a difference where you shecht, or if somebody answers, you give him a different psak, rather than somebody who on his own is going to cover up the blood. So the Gemara therefore offers another answer. The Gemara says that the problem is that there's tircha. So if it's during the week that you shecht a koi, you're allowed to cover the blood. People will think you covered because you have a suffix. They know that koi is a suffix. They won't think that there's been a psak that it's a chaya, and that's why you're covering the blood. They think you're covering it misafik to be on the safe side, and therefore you also have to be on the safe side and not eat its chaylev. However, if you're covering it on Yontif, how do you have a right to cover it on Yontif? It's tircha, it's extra work, it's an activity that it takes away from Yontif enjoyment. Not allowed to do things like that just because of a suffix. People will therefore conclude that it is vadai, we've established that it's vadai achaya, and they'll end up eating its chaylev. Now, the Gemara gives another answer, which is related to this. The Gemara says, once we've brought up the subject of tircha, maybe that's the reason you're not allowed to cover the blood of a kai on Yantif, because it's tircha, it's extra Yantif work. Blood of a chaya you're allowed to. Blood of a kai you're not allowed to. Blood of a chaya is a mitzvah, so therefore there's no tircha. Blood of a kai is tircha, you're not allowed to. Very similar to that, we see a different halacha, that if you have the blood of a chaya, behema, and a bird, all mixed together, you're not allowed to cover the blood, because you're going to end up doing a lot of the covering. You'll do extra work to cover the blood of the behema, and the blood of a behema is not chayiv in kisui. You don't have to cover the blood, so that's extra tircha for no reason on Yantif. In a similar way, just like you can't mix blood, because you just like you can't cover blood, which may be chaya blood, and may be bird blood, and may be behema blood, because it's a suffix. You also can't cover the blood of a kai, which is an animal, which may be a chaya or a behemoth. Now the Gemara says, Rav Yosi bar Yasini says that if you could in one shovelful cover all the mixed bloods of chaya, behema, and of, then there's no extra tircha, then you're allowed to do it. The Gemara says, of course, what's a chiddush? You're covering the blood of the chaya and the of in one fell swoop. Who cares if I'm covering blood of an animal altogether? There's no chiddush to that. First, the chiddush is you shouldn't make gzeira, that you shouldn't cover it with one shovelful, lest you end up covering it with multiple shovelfuls. That's a chiddush. You may think you're making gzeira. There's no such gzeira. Okay, now the Gemara brings a related halacha. Rabba says, if you slaughter a bird on Erev Yantif, before Yantif, you're not allowed to cover its blood on Yantif. If you neglect to cover it before Yantif, you don't have a heter to do that. You're still allowed to eat the meat. There's no isser to eat the meat, and therefore there's no Samchas Yantif issue. But because you're supposed to do it before Yantif, it's a tircha to do it on Yantif, and you're not allowed to do it. Now, what happens if you made a dough to make bread or challah before Yantif, and you forgot to take off challah? You're allowed to take off challah on Yantif. So, just like you're not allowed to shecht the animal, you aren't allowed to cover the blood of the animal. You may think you're not allowed to take off challah. Taking off challah has a potential isser involved. You're being mitakein the bread, the dough, you're fixing it. And just like you're not allowed to take truma on Yantif because you're fixing the truma, you're not allowed to take challah on Yantif because you're fixing the challah. But here, we say that you are allowed to take off challah on Yantif. It's part of the activities to allow you to make bread, and therefore it is permitted. We don't say that it's aser because it's before. Now, Avud Shmuel, Shmuel's father argues, and he says that you're not allowed to. If you made the dough before Yantif, you're supposed to take off challah. Before Yantif, you don't have a heter to take off challah on Yantif. The Gemara says it seems to argue on Shmuel himself. Shmuel is arguing on his father, because Avud Shmuel obviously holds that there's an isser to take off challah on Yantif, but Shmuel holds something which should seem to imply there's no isser to take challah on Yantif. What's that? Shmuel says that in chutzarts, if you have challah on Yantif, that if you have bread that did not have challah taken from it, so the halacha is you could just eat it and leave over a piece at the end, and then that piece you make challah and throw it in the garbage. You could do that after Yantif, make that into challah after Yantif. So you see, according to Shmuel, it's a permitted way of eating challah on Yantif. You could just of eating bread on Yantif without taking challah. Now this only applies in the challah chutz la'aretz, where it's not an isser, where it's not a mitzvah deraisa, and an isser deraisa to eat bread that did not have challah taken from it. It's only a zecher mikdash, zecher teretz yisrael midrabanan. But the point is that Shmuel says, at least in chutz la'aretz, there shouldn't be any problem of taking challah because you're not fixing anything. The whole isser is that you're fixing. Here you're not fixing because there's a permitted way of doing it. So Gemara says no, it's still called taking truma. If you did take off the challah would be aser, right? Yisrael wouldn't be allowed to eat it. Only Kohanim are allowed to eat that challah. It's still called taking truma, and therefore it's included in the gzeira and the iser of taking truma on Yantif, and therefore it's still forbidden, and therefore Avud Shmuel would still say his psak that if you made the dough erev Yantif, you're not allowed to take the challah.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.